The summer of 2021 arrived in Cedar Falls, Iowa, with the kind of heat that made asphalt shimmer and children dream of ice cream trucks. The annual Heartland County Fair had rolled into town like it did every July, transforming the empty lot behind Miller's Hardware into a wonderland of spinning lights and carnival music. The smell of funnel cake and cotton candy drifted through the humid air, mixing with the diesel fumes from the generators that powered the rides. 17-year-old Maya Chen had been looking forward to this night for weeks. She stood at the edge of the midway, her long black hair catching the neon glow from the tilt-a-whirl, wearing her favorite sundress, the yellow one with tiny sunflowers that her grandmother had bought her for graduation. In her hand, she clutched a small purse, the kind teenagers carry when they want to feel grown up but still need somewhere to keep their lip gloss, and the $20 bill their parents gave them for the fair. The evening had unfolded, like a Norman Rockwell painting come to life. Maya had walked the dusty pathways with her best friend Jessica, stopping to throw rings at milk bottles and shriek with laughter when the basketball bounced off the rim instead of swishing through the net. They'd shared a paper cone of blue cotton candy, their fingers sticky with spun sugar, and posed for photos in front of the funhouse mirrors that made them look impossibly tall and thin. But it was the Ferris wheel that had called to Maya that night. The massive structure rose 40 feet into the darkening sky, its passenger cars swaying gently in the evening breeze. She'd always loved heights, the way they made her feel small and infinite at the same time. From the top, she could see the entire town spread out below, the church steeple, the high school football field, the winding path of Cedar Creek that gave the town its name. "One more ride," she'd told Jessica, who was already complaining about her feet hurting in her new sandals. "Just one more and then we'll get some popcorn and head home." The carnival worker who operated the Ferris wheel was a weathered man in his 50s named Pete, who'd been traveling with the fair circuit for more than 20 years. He had kind eyes and gentle hands, and he always made sure the safety bars were secure before sending his passengers up into the night sky. He remembered Maya from previous years, the polite girl who always said please and thank you, who never complained when the ride stopped to let other passengers on and off. "Evening, Miss Maya," Pete had said, tipping his baseball cap as she approached. "Beautiful night for a ride, isn't it?" Maya had smiled, that radiant smile that made everyone around her feel like they were basking in sunlight. "It's perfect, Pete. Absolutely perfect." The Ferris wheel creaked to life, its ancient mechanisms groaning as it began its slow rotation. Maya settled into the metal seat, her hands gripping the safety bar, not out of fear, but out of pure excitement. The ground fell away beneath her feet, and suddenly she was rising above the carnival, above the town, above everything that had seemed so important just moments before. From her vantage point, she could see Jessica buying a bag of kettle corn from the vendor near the entrance, could watch the younger children squealing with delight as they rode the miniature roller coaster, could observe the teenagers clustered around the game booths, trying to impress each other with their skill at knocking down wooden bottles with a baseball. The wheel stopped when she reached the very top, as it always did, allowing her to take in the full panorama of her small world. The summer stars were just beginning to appear in the deepening sky, and a gentle breeze carried the sounds of laughter and music up to her perch. Maya closed her eyes and breathed deeply, trying to memorize this moment, this feeling of being suspended between earth and sky, between childhood and whatever came next. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone, wanting to capture the view, but also wanting to send a quick text to her parents, who were probably wondering when she'd be home. The screen showed 9:47 p.m., and she typed quickly, "Having the best time. Home by 11, promise." The Ferris wheel shuddered back to life, beginning its descent. Maya watched the ground rush up to meet her, felt the familiar flutter in her stomach as gravity reasserted itself. She was thinking about the popcorn Jessica had promised to buy, about the history test she had on Monday, about whether she'd have time to finish the novel she'd been reading before bed. She never imagined these would be her last ordinary thoughts. The wheel completed its rotation, and Pete moved to release the safety bar. Maya stood, smoothing down her sundress, and stepped onto the platform. "Thank you, Pete," she said, as she always did. "See you next year." But as she turned to walk back toward the midway, something caught her eye. A man in a dark jacket was standing near the cotton candy stand, Not eating, not playing games, just watching. There was something about the way he held himself, the way his eyes seemed to follow her movements that made her hesitate. She glanced around, looking for Jessica, but her friend was nowhere to be seen. The man began walking toward her, and Maya felt the first flutter of unease. She quickened her pace, heading toward the bright lights of the game booths where there would be people, safety, witnesses. But the crowd that had seemed so welcoming just moments before now felt like a maze, and she couldn't seem to find her way through it. The last thing anyone remembered seeing was Maya Chen walking away from the Ferris wheel at 9:52 p.m., her yellow sundress bright as a beacon in the carnival lights. If this story moved you, you might want to subscribe. Security cameras would later show her entering the crowd near the ring toss, but she never emerged from the other side. By 11 p.m., when Maya hadn't returned home, her parents began to worry. By midnight, they were calling the police. By dawn, the entire county was searching for a girl who had simply vanished into the night, leaving behind only questions and the echo of carnival music that seemed to play on long after the rides had stopped. The fair packed up and moved on to the next town, as fairs always do. But Maya Chen remained behind, somewhere in the space between present and past, between the last time she was seen and the first time she was truly missed. The investigation would consume the town for months, turning neighbors into suspects and friends into witnesses. But no amount of searching, no number of interviews, no plea from her tearful parents on the local news could bring back what had been lost that night. In the weeks that followed, the details of Maya's disappearance would be dissected and analyzed, theorized about and debated. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of the entire mystery was its very ordinariness, the way a night that had begun with such simple joy could end with such profound absence. The way a girl could be there one moment, breathing in the sweet air of a summer evening, and gone the next, leaving behind only the memory of her laughter and the unanswered question of what happened in those final moments when she walked into the crowd and never walked out. The Ferris wheel would return to Cedar Falls the following summer, and the summer after that, but it would never be quite the same. Children would still ride it, couples would still kiss at the top, and the view would still be beautiful. But there would always be an empty seat, always be the ghost of a girl in a yellow sundress who had loved the feeling of being suspended between earth and sky, between the known and the unknown, between the last moment of her ordinary life and the first moment of her eternal mystery. 3 years had passed since Maya Chen vanished into the warm July night, and Cedar Falls had learned to live with the weight of unanswered questions. The missing person posters that had once covered every storefront window and telephone pole had faded and been replaced by newer announcements: high school graduation ceremonies, church bake sales, the annual 4th of July parade. But Maya's absence remained a constant presence, a shadow that fell across every celebration, every ordinary moment that should have included her. Detective Sarah Morrison had been assigned to Maya's case from the beginning, and it had become the defining investigation of her 20-year career. At 45, Sarah was a Cedar Falls native who understood the rhythms of small-town life, the way secrets could hide in plain sight, and the way everyone knew everyone else's business, except when it mattered most. She kept Maya's case file on her desk, not buried in some filing cabinet, because she believed that unsolved cases demanded daily attention, constant vigilance, the kind of persistent hope that refused to accept defeat. The initial search had been massive and methodical. Within hours of Maya's disappearance, every available officer from 3 counties had descended on Cedar Falls. K-9 units had swept the fairgrounds, the surrounding farmland, and every building within a 5-mile radius. Volunteers had formed search parties that combed through cornfields and creek beds, calling Maya's name until their voices were hoarse. The FBI had been brought in, their behavioral analysts creating profiles and their technical teams analyzing every piece of digital evidence they could find. Maya's phone had been recovered 2 days later, found in a drainage ditch a mile from the fairgrounds. The device was damaged but functional, and the last text message she'd sent, the one promising to be home by 11, remained on the screen like a ghost of intention. The phone's GPS data showed that it had remained stationary at the fairgrounds until 10:15 p.m., then had moved rapidly along Highway 34 before stopping at the location where it was found. But there was no Maya, no explanation for how her phone had ended up in a ditch while she remained missing. The investigation had followed every possible lead. The Carnival workers had been interviewed multiple times, their backgrounds checked and rechecked. Pete, the Ferris wheel operator who had been one of the last people to see Maya, had submitted to polygraph tests and allowed investigators to search his trailer. The man in the dark jacket that Maya had noticed had never been identified, despite extensive canvassing and appeals for information. Security footage from the fairgrounds was grainy and incomplete, showing Maya entering the crowd, but never showing her leaving. David and Linda Chen, Maya's parents, had aged a decade in the 3 years since their daughter's disappearance. David, who had once been the energetic manager of the local bank, now moved through his days with the deliberate slowness of someone carrying an invisible burden. Linda, a high school math teacher, had taken a leave of absence that had stretched into an indefinite hiatus. They had become fixtures at community meetings, always asking the same questions, always hoping for new answers that never came. The town had rallied around the Chen family initially, organizing fundraisers and search efforts, providing meals and emotional support. But as weeks turned to months and months turned to years, the intensity of that support had naturally diminished. People had their own lives to live, their own problems to solve. The initial shock of Maya's disappearance had settled into a dull ache, a reminder that sometimes terrible things happen to good people for no reason at all. Jessica, Maya's best friend, had perhaps been affected most profoundly by the disappearance. The guilt she felt at not staying with Maya that night, at choosing to buy popcorn instead of taking one more ride on the Ferris wheel, had shaped every day of her life since. She had started college at Iowa State, but found herself unable to concentrate on her studies, unable to enjoy the normal experiences of young adulthood when her best friend remained frozen in time at 17. The case had generated its share of false leads and dead ends. A woman in Minnesota had called to report seeing Maya at a truck stop, but the security footage showed someone else entirely. A psychic from California had claimed to have visions of Maya being held in a farmhouse basement, leading to an exhaustive search of rural properties that yielded nothing. Well-meaning amateur detectives had created elaborate theories on internet forums, analyzing every detail of the case with the kind of obsessive intensity that often obscured more than it revealed. Detective Morrison had investigated hundreds of tips, followed every possible lead, and interviewed everyone who had ever known Maya. She had studied the case files of similar disappearances, looking for patterns or connections that might provide a breakthrough. She had consulted with experts in kidnapping cases, human trafficking, and missing persons, seeking any insight that might explain what had happened to a 17-year-old girl who had simply vanished into thin air. The physical evidence was frustratingly minimal. There had been no signs of struggle, no witnesses to an abduction, no ransom demands or communications from whoever might have taken Maya. It was as if she had simply stepped out of existence, leaving behind only the echo of her last words to Pete and the memory of her yellow sundress disappearing into the crowd. The anniversary of Maya's disappearance had become an annual vigil, held in the town park on the evening of July 15th. Hundreds of people would gather, holding candles and sharing memories, keeping alive the hope that somehow, somewhere, Maya might still be found. The local news stations would run retrospective stories, interviewing the same people, asking the same questions, maintaining the fiction that constant media attention might somehow generate the breakthrough that 3 years of investigation had failed to produce. But it was the smaller moments that truly captured the impact of Maya's absence. The empty seat at every high school reunion her class would ever have, the college acceptance letter that arrived 3 months after she disappeared, addressed to someone who would never read it, the way her parents still set 3 places at the dinner table, then quietly put one away, the way Jessica still found herself reaching for her phone to text Maya about something funny or interesting, only to remember that those conversations would never happen again. The investigation had officially remained open, but the active search efforts had gradually wound down. Detective Morrison continued to work the case, but she also had new crimes to investigate, new victims who needed justice, new families who needed answers. The reality of police work in a small town meant that resources were limited, and unsolved cases, no matter how heartbreaking, eventually had to compete with current emergencies. Maya's bedroom had remained exactly as she had left it on that July evening 3 years ago. Her parents had been unable to change anything, as if preserving the space might somehow preserve the possibility of her return. Her clothes still hung in the closet, her books still sat on the desk, her stuffed animals still occupied their places on the bed. It was a shrine to interrupted possibility, a monument to all the things that might have been. The case had fundamentally changed Cedar Falls, transforming it from a place where people left their doors unlocked to one where parents watched their children with constant vigilance. The annual county fair still came to town, but it was never quite the same. The Ferris wheel still turned, the games still beckoned, the cotton candy still spun into sugary clouds. But there was an undercurrent of wariness now, a collective memory of how quickly joy could turn to sorrow, how easily a perfect summer evening could become a nightmare. As the 3rd anniversary of Maya's disappearance approached, Detective Morrison found herself returning to the case file with renewed intensity. She spread the photographs across her desk, studying them for details she might have missed, patterns she might have overlooked. Somewhere in the accumulated evidence of 3 years of investigation, she believed there had to be a clue, a thread that would unravel the mystery of what had happened to Maya Chen. She had no way of knowing that the answer was closer than she imagined, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The truth about Maya's disappearance would emerge not from the extensive investigation or the countless interviews, but from the most unlikely source, a discarded piece of carnival trash that had somehow survived 3 years of weather and neglect, carrying with it a message that would change everything. The morning of July 12, 2024, dawned with the kind of oppressive humidity that made the air itself feel thick and difficult to breathe. Cedar Falls was preparing for another county fair, the 4th since Maya's disappearance, and the familiar sounds of carnival setup echoed across the empty lot behind Miller's Hardware. The same traveling carnival company had won the contract every year, bringing with them the same rides, the same games, the same bittersweet memories of what had been lost. Marcus Thompson, a 16-year-old who had been too young to remember Maya personally, but old enough to understand the weight of her absence, was working his first summer job helping with the carnival setup. His supervisor, a gruff man named Danny, who had been with the carnival for 15 years, had assigned him to the unglamorous task of cleaning up the grounds before the rides were assembled. It was hot, dirty work that involved picking up 3 seasons' worth of accumulated debris, broken glass, rusted metal, and the countless pieces of trash that somehow found their way into every corner of the lot. Marcus had been working since dawn, his t-shirt already soaked with sweat despite the early hour. He moved methodically through the tall grass that had grown up around the perimeter of the lot, filling garbage bags with the detritus of small-town life. Beer cans from teenage parties, fast food wrappers blown in from the highway, scraps of paper and plastic that had somehow survived multiple winters and springs. It was near the spot where the Ferris wheel would be erected that Marcus found something that made him pause. Half buried in the dirt, partially hidden by overgrown weeds, was a large paper bag, the kind used for popcorn at carnivals and movie theaters. The bag was weathered and stained, clearly having been exposed to the elements for a considerable time, but it was still intact enough to be recognizable. Marcus almost threw it away without a second thought. After all, finding old carnival trash on carnival grounds was hardly surprising, but something about the bag caught his attention, a detail that made him look more closely. There was a mark on the side of the bag, a reddish stain that looked different from the usual dirt and weather damage. It was too deliberate, too carefully placed to be accidental. He knelt in the dirt and examined the bag more carefully. The stain was definitely lipstick, a deep red color that had somehow maintained its vibrancy despite 3 years of exposure to rain, snow, and sun. But it wasn't just a random smudge. The lipstick had been used to write something, to create marks that looked almost like letters or symbols. The writing was faded and partially illegible, but Marcus could make out what appeared to be a series of numbers and letters arranged in a pattern that seemed intentional. Marcus called out to Danny, who was supervising the unloading of the tilt-a-whirl components. "Hey Danny, you need to see this." Danny walked over, wiping his hands on his coveralls and looking irritated at the interruption. "What is it, kid? We've got a lot of work to do before—" He stopped mid-sentence when he saw the bag in Marcus's hands. Something about the teenager's expression, the careful way he was holding the weathered paper, made Danny understand that this wasn't just another piece of trash. "Where did you find this?" Danny asked, his voice suddenly serious. "Right over there." Marcus pointed to the spot where the grass was trampled down. "It was buried pretty deep, like it's been here for a long time. But look at this." He showed Danny the lipstick markings. "This isn't random. Someone wrote something on this bag." Danny took the bag carefully, studying the faded markings. He had been working carnivals for 15 years, and he knew about the girl who had disappeared from this very fairgrounds 3 years ago. Every year when they returned to Cedar Falls, the story was retold, the mystery discussed, the absence felt by everyone who worked the fair. The possibility that this seemingly insignificant piece of trash might be connected to that disappearance made his hands shake slightly as he held it. "We need to call the police," Danny said quietly. "Right now." Detective Morrison arrived at the fairgrounds within 20 minutes of receiving the call. She had been preparing for the usual influx of petty crimes that accompanied the county fair. Pickpocketing, underage drinking, the occasional fight. But the description of what Marcus had found made her heart race with a mixture of hope and apprehension. After 3 years of dead ends and false leads, the possibility of genuine evidence was both thrilling and terrifying. She found Marcus and Danny standing exactly where they had been when Danny made the call, neither of them willing to move or touch anything that might disturb potential evidence. The bag lay on the ground between them, its lipstick markings barely visible in the morning light, but clearly present to anyone who looked closely. Morrison knelt beside the bag, pulling on latex gloves before carefully lifting it. The paper was surprisingly well preserved, protected by the tall grass and the specific soil conditions of the lot, but it was the lipstick writing that made her breath catch in her throat. The markings were definitely intentional, definitely meant to convey information. They appeared to be a combination of numbers and letters, arranged in groups that suggested some kind of code. "Has anyone else seen this?" Morrison asked. "Just us," Danny replied. "Marcus found it about an hour ago and I called you right away. We haven't moved it or touched it except to pick it up." Morrison photographed the bag from multiple angles, documenting its position and the surrounding area. She then carefully placed it in an evidence bag, sealing it with the kind of methodical precision that came from years of handling potential evidence. But even as she followed proper procedure, her mind was racing with possibilities. The lipstick color looked familiar, though she couldn't immediately place where she had seen it before. The code, if it was indeed a code, was unlike anything she had encountered in her years of police work. But the location where it had been found, the age of the bag, the careful way the message had been written, all suggested that this might be the breakthrough they had been waiting for. Back at the police station, Morrison spread high-resolution photographs of the bag across her desk. Under better lighting and magnification, the lipstick markings became clearer. They appeared to read B4712-1L9H3R8N25E6M4 P11S10WA15T1413CY16FZ 17018U19I20J21K22Q23V 24X25G26D. The sequence was clearly deliberate, but its meaning remained obscure. Morrison had dealt with codes before, usually in drug cases where dealers use simple substitution ciphers to hide their communications, but this seemed more sophisticated, more personal. The combination of numbers and letters suggested either a very complex cipher or possibly multiple layers of meaning. She called in Officer Michael Chen, the department's youngest detective, and someone who had grown up with computers and might have insights into modern code-breaking techniques. Michael had also been Maya's cousin, which added a personal dimension to his involvement in the case. He studied the photographs with the kind of intense focus that came from both professional duty and family loyalty. "This is definitely a cipher," Michael said after several minutes of analysis. "But it's not a simple substitution code. The pattern suggests something more complex, maybe a book cipher or a coordinate system. The numbers and letters are too specific to be random." Morrison nodded, feeling the familiar flutter of excitement that came with a genuine lead. What do you think it means? I'm not sure yet, Michael admitted. But someone went to a lot of trouble to write this message. They used lipstick, which would be more permanent than pen or pencil in outdoor conditions. They chose a popcorn bag, which would be common at a carnival but also large enough to write on. And they buried or hid it in a place where it might eventually be found. The implications were staggering. If the bag was connected to Maya's disappearance, it suggested that she had been able to leave a message, a clue to her fate or location. But it also raised troubling questions about why the message was so elaborate, why it had taken 3 years to be discovered, and what had happened to Maya in the time since she had disappeared. Morrison made copies of the photographs and began the process of consulting with experts in cryptography and code breaking. She reached out to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, to academic specialists in linguistics and mathematics, to anyone who might be able to decipher the meaning of the lipstick markings. But she also began her own analysis, studying the pattern of numbers and letters, looking for clues that might reveal the message's meaning. The discovery of the bag had reignited the investigation, but it had also raised the stakes considerably. If Maya had been able to leave a coded message, it suggested that she had been aware of her situation, that she had been trying to communicate with the outside world. But it also suggested that her disappearance had been more complex than a simple abduction, that there had been time and opportunity for her to create and hide a message. As Morrison worked late into the night, analyzing the photographs and consulting with experts, she couldn't shake the feeling that the answer was somehow simpler than it appeared. The code was elaborate, but Maya had been a 17-year-old girl, not a professional spy. Whatever system she had used to create the message, it had to be something she could remember and execute under stress. The lipstick itself was another clue. Morrison had checked Maya's personal effects and found that she had carried a tube of deep red lipstick in her purse the night she disappeared. The color matched the markings on the bag, suggesting that Maya had used her own lipstick to write the message. But when and where had she written it? And how had the bag ended up buried in the tall grass of the fairgrounds? The discovery of the popcorn bag had transformed the investigation from a cold case into an active mystery. After 3 years of silence, Maya Chen was speaking again, her voice carried by lipstick markings on a piece of carnival trash. The message was cryptic and challenging, but it was also proof that she had been alive, at least long enough to write it. The question now was whether Detective Morrison could decode the message in time to follow wherever Maya was trying to lead them. The forensics lab at the State Police headquarters in Des Moines had seen countless pieces of evidence over the years, but the weathered popcorn bag with its faded lipstick markings presented a unique challenge. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the lab's chief forensic analyst, had been working with evidence for nearly 30 years, but she had never encountered anything quite like this. The bag had been treated with every preservation technique at her disposal, photographed under various lighting conditions, and analyzed for any additional clues it might contain. The lipstick itself had been identified as Revlon Color Stay in the shade Really Red, a common drugstore brand that Maya had been known to wear. Microscopic analysis confirmed that the markings had been applied directly to the paper, not transferred from another surface. The pressure patterns suggested that the writing had been done carefully, deliberately, by someone who had time to think about what they were creating. Detective Morrison had spent the past week consulting with experts from across the country. A retired NSA codebreaker named Dr. James Mitchell had examined the sequence and determined that it was likely a substitution cipher, but with multiple layers of encoding. A linguistics professor from the University of Iowa had suggested that the pattern might represent a personal code known only to Maya, possibly based on something significant from her life. But it was Maya's cousin, Officer Michael Chen, who finally found the key to understanding the message. He had been studying the cipher for days, trying every standard code-breaking technique he knew when he remembered something from his childhood. Maya had always been obsessed with word puzzles and brain teasers. She had subscribed to puzzle magazines and spent hours working on crosswords and cryptograms. "What if it's not a traditional cipher?" Michael suggested during one of their late-night sessions in the police station. "What if it's something more personal, something that would make sense to Maya but not to anyone else?" Morrison looked up from the photographs she had been studying. "What do you mean?" Maya loved word games. She was always creating puzzles for the family to solve during holidays and gatherings. She had this way of making everything into a game, including the way she communicated. Michael paused, pulling out his phone to scroll through old text messages. "Look at this." He showed Morrison a text message from Maya, sent just a few months before her disappearance. Instead of writing, "See you at 7, she had written, "See you, error 7. But the message was more complex than simple text speak. She had created a pattern using numbers and letters that corresponded to their positions in the alphabet. She was always doing stuff like this, Michael explained, turning regular words into puzzles. What if this code on the bag is the same kind of thing? Morrison felt a surge of excitement. "Show me how it works." Michael grabbed a piece of paper and began writing. "If we assume that the numbers correspond to alphabet positions, 1 equals A, 2 equals B, and so on, then some of this starts to make sense. But there are too many numbers, so there has to be another layer." They worked together, trying different combinations and patterns. The breakthrough came when Michael realized that the sequence wasn't meant to be read linearly. Instead, the numbers and letters formed coordinates, with the numbers representing positions and the letters representing additional information. B47 12.1 L9 H3 R8 N25 E6 M4 P11 S10 WA15 T14 13 CY 16 FZ 17 O18 U19 I20 J21 K22 Q23 V 24 X25 G26D. What if the B at the beginning stands for begin or book, Michael suggested, and the numbers that follow are page numbers or coordinates? Morrison nodded, beginning to see the pattern. But coordinates to what? The answer came from an unexpected source. Jessica, Maya's best friend, had been following the investigation closely, and when she heard about the coded message, she asked to see a copy of the photographs. She studied the markings with the intense focus of someone who had shared countless inside jokes and secret communications with Maya. "This looks like something from our English class," Jessica said quietly. "We had to do a project on hidden messages in literature, and Maya became obsessed with book ciphers. She said they were the perfect way to hide a message because you needed two things to decode it, the cipher and the key book." Morrison's pulse quickened. "What book?" "We used To Kill a Mockingbird for our project because everyone in our class had a copy, but Maya was always reading. She carried books everywhere." Jessica paused, thinking. "Wait, she had a book with her that night at the Carnival. I remember because she was reading it while we were waiting in line for the Ferris wheel." The police had inventoried Maya's personal belongings after her disappearance, and Morrison quickly retrieved the evidence box from storage. Among Maya's possessions was a paperback copy of The Great Gatsby, well worn and filled with handwritten notes in the margins. The book had been considered insignificant at the time, just another piece of personal property that revealed nothing about her disappearance. But now, with the possibility that it might be the key to the coded message, the book took on new significance. Morrison carefully opened it, looking for any markings or annotations that might correspond to the numbers in the cipher. The breakthrough came when Michael applied the coordinate system to the text. Using the numbers as page, line, and word references, the coded message began to reveal itself. Basement Warehouse, Highway 92, East Mile Marker 14, Help. The words sent a chill through the room. Maya had managed to encode a location, a specific place that could be mapped and searched. Highway 92 East ran through rural Iowa, passing through farmland and small towns. Mile marker 14 would be about 20 miles east of Cedar Falls, in an area of abandoned farm buildings and industrial sites. Morrison immediately dispatched units to the location, but she also felt a growing sense of urgency mixed with dread. The message was 3 years old, and there was no way to know what they might find at the coordinates Maya had so carefully encoded. The fact that she had been able to create and hide such an elaborate message suggested that she had been held somewhere, that she had been alive for at least some period after her disappearance. The warehouse that the search team found at mile marker 14 was a deteriorating concrete building that had once been used for grain storage. It sat on a property that had been abandoned for years, surrounded by overgrown fields and accessible only by a dirt road that was barely visible from the highway. The building itself was unremarkable, the kind of structure that dotted the Iowa landscape. forgotten remnants of the state's agricultural past. But in the basement of the warehouse, investigators found evidence that transformed the building into a crime scene. There were signs that someone had been held there: a makeshift bed, empty food containers, and most chillingly, additional lipstick markings on the concrete walls. The markings were similar to those on the popcorn bag, suggesting that Maya had been in this location and had continued to leave coded messages. The basement also contained items that had clearly belonged to Maya: a hair elastic, a piece of jewelry, and a small notebook filled with what appeared to be more coded messages. But Maya herself was not there. The basement showed signs of having been cleaned recently, with bleach stains on the floor, and walls that suggested someone had attempted to destroy evidence. The discovery of the warehouse basement provided crucial evidence, but it also raised more questions than it answered. Maya had clearly been held there, but for how long? Who had taken her and why? And most importantly, where was she now? DNA evidence found in the basement confirmed that Maya had been there, but it also revealed traces of other people. The investigation suddenly expanded from a missing person case to a potential kidnapping and trafficking operation. The FBI was brought in to coordinate with local law enforcement, and the search for Maya Chen became part of a larger investigation into organized crime. The coded message on the popcorn bag had been Maya's lifeline, her way of communicating with the outside world even while being held captive. But decoding it had taken 3 years, and the question now was whether she had been able to leave other messages, other clues that might lead to her current location. Detective Morrison stood in the basement of the warehouse, studying the lipstick markings on the walls, trying to understand the mind of a 17-year-old girl who had found a way to fight back against her captors using nothing but intelligence, courage, and a tube of red lipstick. The message had been decoded, but Maya's story was far from over. The discovery of the warehouse basement had transformed the investigation from a local missing person case into a multi-state federal operation. FBI Special Agent Rachel Torres, a veteran investigator with the Bureau's Human Trafficking Task Force, had been assigned to lead the expanded investigation. She arrived in Cedar Falls with a team of specialists and a grim understanding of what Maya's coded message likely represented. Agent Torres had seen too many cases like this over her 15-year career with the Bureau. Young women who disappeared from ordinary places, shopping malls, college campuses, small-town festivals, only to surface years later as victims of trafficking networks that moved them across state lines like commodities. But Maya's case was different in one crucial respect. Her intelligence and resourcefulness had allowed her to leave a trail of breadcrumbs that investigators could follow. The lipstick markings found on the basement walls were more complex than the original message on the popcorn bag. Maya had clearly spent considerable time in the warehouse, and she had used that time to document everything she could observe about her captors and her situation. The FBI's cryptography team worked around the clock to decode the additional messages, revealing a disturbing pattern of movement and activity. One message, written in tiny letters near the floor where it might go unnoticed, decoded to, "3 men change every Tuesday, blonde woman visits Thursdays, speaks Spanish." Another, hidden behind a loose concrete block, revealed, "Moved 4 girls last month, van license starts BGX heading west Interstate 80. The information Maya had gathered painted a picture of a sophisticated operation that moved victims regularly between multiple locations. The coded messages suggested that she had been held in the warehouse for several months, during which time she had observed the patterns of her captors and documented everything she could remember about other victims. Detective Morrison worked closely with Agent Torres, sharing her knowledge of the local area and the timeline of Maya's disappearance. Together, they began mapping the network that Maya's messages had revealed, identifying potential routes and locations where other safe houses might be operating. The investigation expanded to include Iowa, Nebraska, and Missouri, following the interstate highways that Maya had referenced in her coded communications. The blonde woman who spoke Spanish became a key focus of the investigation. Surveillance footage from truck stops and convenience stores along Interstate 80 was reviewed, looking for any woman matching the description Maya had provided. The license plate fragment, BGX, was run through databases, generating a list of vehicles that had to be investigated and eliminated one by one. Maya's parents, David and Linda Chen, found themselves caught between hope and despair as the investigation intensified. The discovery of the coded messages proved that their daughter had been alive, at least for some period after her disappearance, but it also confirmed their worst fears about what had happened to her. The knowledge that Maya had been held captive, that she had been moved around like cargo, was almost more painful than the uncertainty they had lived with for 3 years. "She was fighting," Linda Chen said quietly during one of the briefing sessions with investigators. "Even in that terrible situation, she was fighting. She was trying to come home." The FBI team established a command center in Cedar Falls, coordinating with law enforcement agencies across the Midwest. The investigation revealed connections to similar disappearances in other states, young women who had vanished from public places and left behind no trace. The pattern suggested a network that had been operating for years, possibly decades, moving victims through a circuit of locations that stretched across the country. Dr. Sarah Kim, a forensic psychologist with the FBI, analyzed Maya's coded messages for insights into her mental state and the conditions of her captivity. The messages revealed a young woman who had maintained remarkable composure under extreme stress, who had turned her love of puzzles and word games into a survival tool. She was creating a record, Dr. Kim explained to the task force. Not just of her own situation, but of everything she observed. She understood that she might not survive, but she wanted to make sure that others could be saved. The coded messages also revealed Maya's efforts to help other victims. One particularly heart-wrenching message decoded to, "Girl from Nebraska, aged 15, calls herself star real name unknown diabetic needs medicine." Another read, "Twins from Missouri, maybe sisters, very young, scared, don't speak English, protected them when possible." These references to other victims expanded the investigation even further as the FBI worked to identify missing persons who might match Maya's descriptions. The twins from Missouri were eventually identified as sisters who had disappeared from a St. Louis playground 2 years earlier. The diabetic girl from Nebraska matched the description of a teenager who had vanished from a county fair in Omaha around the same time as Maya. The investigation began to reveal the true scope of the trafficking network that had taken Maya. It was larger and more organized than anyone had initially suspected, with connections to similar operations across the Midwest. The warehouse where Maya had been held was just one node in a network that included dozens of locations and hundreds of victims. Agent Torres coordinated raids on suspected safe houses in 3 states, based on the intelligence Maya had provided in her coded messages. The raids yielded arrests and rescued several victims, but Maya was not among them. The network had clearly moved her to another location, possibly in response to increased law enforcement attention. The psychological profile of Maya that emerged from her coded messages showed a young woman of extraordinary resilience and intelligence. Even under the most horrific circumstances, she had maintained her ability to think strategically, to observe her environment, and to communicate with the outside world. Her messages showed no self-pity or despair, only a determined focus on gathering information that might help others. But the messages also revealed the toll that captivity was taking on her. The later codes became more urgent, more desperate in their tone. One message, written in what appeared to be her own blood when lipstick was not available, simply read, "Running out of time." The investigation had reached a critical juncture. Maya's coded messages had provided valuable intelligence about the trafficking network, but they had also revealed that she was in immediate danger. The question was no longer just where she was being held, but whether she was still alive to be rescued. Agent Torres assembled a joint task force with representatives from multiple agencies, pooling resources and expertise to follow every lead Maya's messages had provided. The investigation had become a race against time, with the knowledge that every day of delay might mean the difference between rescue and tragedy. The small town of Cedar Falls had become the center of a major federal investigation, with FBI agents and support staff working around the clock to decode Maya's messages and track down the network that had taken her. The community that had never quite recovered from her disappearance now found itself at the heart of an operation that might save not only Maya, but dozens of other victims. Detective Morrison stood in the warehouse basement where Maya had been held, studying the walls covered with coded messages. Each marking represented hours of careful thought, desperate hope, and incredible courage. Maya Chen had found a way to speak from captivity, to reach across time and space to guide the investigation that might save her life. The breakthrough came at 3:47 a.m. on a cold October morning, 6 months after the discovery of the popcorn bag that had started everything. Agent Torres was reviewing surveillance footage from a truck stop in western Missouri when her phone rang with news that would change the trajectory of the entire investigation. A trucker named Billy Reeves had walked into the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office with a piece of evidence that he said had been bothering him for weeks. Billy was a 30-year veteran of long-haul trucking who had driven every highway between Denver and Detroit more times than he could count. He was the kind of man who noticed things, the way traffic patterns changed with the seasons, the faces of the regulars at his favorite truck stops, the small details that made each stretch of road unique. 3 weeks earlier, while taking his mandatory rest break at a service plaza outside Columbia, Missouri, he had found something that didn't belong. It was another popcorn bag, similar to the one that had been found in Cedar Falls. But this one was tucked inside the women's restroom of the truck stop, hidden behind the toilet paper dispenser, where only someone specifically looking for it would find it. Like the first bag, it bore lipstick markings that formed a coded message, but these markings were different, more urgent, more desperate, written with the kind of careful haste that suggested time was running out. "I probably would have thrown it away like any other piece of trash," Billy explained to the sheriff's deputy, who took his statement. "But then I saw the news story about that missing girl and the coded messages, and I started thinking. This bag looked exactly like the one they showed on TV, and those red markings sure looked deliberate." Agent Torres was on a helicopter to Missouri within 2 hours of receiving the call. The truck stop was part of a major interstate highway system that connected to the routes Maya had referenced in her previous messages. If she had somehow managed to leave another coded communication, it meant she was still alive, still fighting, still trying to lead investigators to her location. The new message was longer and more complex than any of Maya's previous codes. The lipstick markings covered nearly the entire surface of the bag, written in tiny letters that required magnification to read clearly. But what struck Agent Torres immediately was the change in Maya's handwriting. Where her previous messages had been carefully composed, almost elegant in their precision, this writing showed signs of physical distress, trembling hands, uneven pressure, the kind of urgency that came from writing in fear of discovery. Back in Cedar Falls, the FBI's cryptography team worked to decode the new message, while forensics experts confirmed that the lipstick was the same brand and color that Maya had used for her previous communications. The genetic material on the bag confirmed what everyone hoped and feared. Maya was still alive, but she was in serious danger. The decoded message revealed Maya's current situation in stark, terrifying detail. Final location before sale: Warehouse District, Kansas City, basement below Import-Export Company, Boulevard Industrial, only chance left. Tell family I tried to come home. The message hit the investigation team like a physical blow. The word sale confirmed what they had suspected, but hoped wasn't true. Maya was being prepared for final transfer to buyers who would take her far beyond the reach of law enforcement. The reference to it being her final location suggested that time had run out, that this was her last opportunity to communicate with the outside world. But Maya had also provided specific location information. The Warehouse District in Kansas City was a sprawling industrial area with dozens of import-export businesses, many of which operated with minimal oversight and maximum privacy. Agent Torres immediately coordinated with Kansas City FBI and local police to begin surveillance of potential targets. The personal message to her family broke the hearts of everyone who read it. After 3 years of captivity, after enduring horrors that could barely be imagined, Maya's final thought was to let her parents know that she had never stopped trying to return to them. The simple phrase, "I tried to come home," carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories of courage, hope, and determination. David and Linda Chen were informed of the new message at a meeting in the Cedar Falls police station. Linda collapsed into her husband's arms when she heard the decoded words, overwhelmed by the mixture of hope and terror that came with knowing their daughter was still alive, but in mortal danger. David, who had remained stoically composed throughout 3 years of uncertainty, finally broke down completely, his sobs echoing through the small conference room. "She's still fighting," he managed to say through his tears. "After all this time, she's still our Maya, still fighting to come home." Agent Torres had less than 48 hours to organize a coordinated response. The word "sail" in Maya's message suggested an imminent transfer that would likely move her beyond recovery. The FBI assembled a joint task force with Kansas City Police, DEA agents familiar with the area's criminal networks, and specialized rescue teams trained in victim recovery operations. The surveillance of Kansas City's warehouse district began immediately, with teams monitoring every import-export business that matched Maya's description. The area was a maze of concrete buildings and industrial facilities, many of which had basements and underground areas that could conceal trafficking operations. But Maya's coded messages had provided enough specific detail to narrow the search to a manageable number of targets. The break came when surveillance teams observed unusual activity at a building owned by Meridian Import Services, a company that appeared to do very little actual importing but maintained a large facility with multiple entrances and heavy security. The building was located on Industrial Boulevard, exactly as Maya had indicated, and thermal imaging revealed basement areas that weren't visible from street level. Agent Torres studied the building plans and satellite imagery, looking for the best approach to a rescue operation. The facility was designed like a fortress, with limited access points and security systems that would alert anyone inside to the approach of law enforcement. But Maya's intelligence about the basement location gave them a tactical advantage. They knew exactly where to focus their efforts. The rescue operation was scheduled for dawn on October 15th, exactly 3 years and 3 months after Maya had disappeared from the Cedar Falls Carnival. Agent Torres briefed her team in the pre-dawn darkness, emphasizing the need for speed and precision. They would have one chance to reach Maya before her captors could harm her or move her to another location. "Remember," Torres told her team, "we're not just rescuing one person. We're saving someone who has spent 3 years gathering intelligence about a trafficking network that has destroyed dozens of lives. Maya Chen is not just a victim. She's been an undercover agent operating behind enemy lines, and she's given us everything we need to take down the people who took her." The raid began at exactly 6 a.m., with simultaneous entries through multiple access points. The basement where Maya was being held was reached within minutes, but what the rescue team found there would haunt them for the rest of their careers. Maya was alive, but barely. 3 years of captivity had taken an enormous physical and psychological toll, but her eyes still held the intelligence and determination that had allowed her to survive and communicate with the outside world. She was not alone in the basement. 6 other young women were being held in conditions that defied description, and Maya's coded messages had allowed law enforcement to rescue all of them simultaneously. The trafficking network that had taken Maya had been dismantled, its leaders arrested, and its victims finally freed. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about Maya's rescue was what investigators found written on the basement wall in lipstick, apparently composed just hours before the raid. It was not a coded message this time, but a simple statement written in clear, bold letters. "Mama, Daddy, I kept my promise. I am coming home." Maya Chen had spent 3 years in captivity, but she had never stopped being the brilliant, determined young woman who had loved word puzzles and Ferris wheel rides. She had turned her intelligence into a weapon against her captors, her love of codes into a lifeline that had ultimately saved not only herself, but countless other victims. The popcorn bag found in the tall grass behind Miller's Hardware had been the first thread in a tapestry of courage that had taken 3 years to fully unravel. Maya's final message, written on the wall of her prison just hours before her rescue, was both an ending and a beginning. The end of a nightmare that had lasted 3 years, and the beginning of a journey home that had always been her ultimate destination. Detective Morrison was there when Maya was brought out of the basement, wrapped in blankets and surrounded by FBI agents and medical personnel. The 17-year-old girl who had vanished from the carnival was now 20, But in her eyes, Morrison could still see the intelligence and spirit that had allowed her to survive and ultimately save herself through the power of coded words written in red lipstick on pieces of Carnival trash. Maya Chen was finally coming home to Cedar Falls, carrying with her the story of how a love of puzzles and an unbreakable determination to return to family had allowed her to speak across time and space, to guide an investigation that had saved not only her own life, but the lives of dozens of other victims. The mystery that had begun with a missing girl and a Ferris wheel ride had ended with the destruction of a trafficking network and the rescue of victims across multiple states. But perhaps most importantly, it had ended with Maya Chen keeping the promise she had made to her parents 3 years earlier when she had texted them from the top of the Ferris wheel she was finally coming home.